Something in your life has already ended. Not visibly, not publicly, no announcement, no dramatic collapse people could point to and say, that was the moment. But internally, something fundamental stopped working. The identity you have been operating from for years is no longer holding its structure. The strategies that once gave you stability are now producing friction. The motivations that used to move you forward barely register anymore. And if you are honest, there is a quiet discomfort growing in the background of your days. Most men misread this moment. They assume they are burned out, distracted, unmotivated, maybe even broken. But that interpretation protects the ego. It allows the mind to believe the problem is temporary, that a vacation, a new routine, a little more discipline will restore the old momentum. It will not. Because the problem is not your energy. The problem is that the version of you that built your current life is beginning to expire. And expiration is unsettling. You feel it in strange ways. Tasks that once felt meaningful now feel mechanical. Conversations with people you've known for years feel strangely distant, as if you're observing them from behind glass. Goals that once gave you direction now feel strangely hollow, even if you continue pursuing them out of habit. Nothing looks dramatically wrong from the outside, but internally something is misaligned. Your mind senses it, your body senses it, but your identity resists naming it, because if you acknowledge what is happening, you also acknowledge a dangerous implication. The life structure you built may not be compatible with the person you are becoming. That realization creates psychological tension most people cannot tolerate, so they distract themselves, they scroll, they chase stimulation, they add noise to their lives to avoid confronting the quiet signal underneath it all. But the signal does not disappear. It grows. You start noticing how much of your behavior is automated, how many decisions you make are based on maintaining stability rather than building strength, how often you tolerate environments, relationships, expectations that quietly reduce your internal standard. At first, this awareness feels like dissatisfaction. Then it becomes something sharper, a quiet accusation. Because once you see it, you cannot fully return to ignorance. You begin to recognize a pattern. The way you move through your days was not consciously designed. It was assembled gradually through adaptation, expectations from family, cultural definitions of success, opportunities you accepted simply because they were available. Piece by piece, a life formed, functional, stable, socially acceptable. But now something uncomfortable is surfacing beneath that structure. It no longer fits. And the most unsettling part is this. Nothing catastrophic had to happen to trigger this shift. There was no obvious failure, no visible collapse forcing reinvention. Instead, the tension is internal, quiet, persistent, as if some deeper part of your mind has started auditing your identity and quietly concluding that too much of it was built for survival rather than mastery. That realization creates a dangerous crossroads, because once a man senses that his current identity is outdated, two paths open. The first path is denial. He doubles down on the existing structure. He convinces himself that comfort equals success, that stability equals fulfillment. He numbs the signal and continues performing the role he has already memorized. Many people spend their entire lives doing exactly this. The second path is far more unsettling. He allows the discomfort to grow. He watches the cracks in his current identity without immediately patching them. He begins questioning the assumptions that built his life in the first place. And that process does not feel empowering. It feels destabilizing. Because the moment you begin examining your identity honestly, an uncomfortable question emerges that most people avoid for decades. If the man you have been is no longer sufficient, then who exactly are you becoming? Most people rush to answer that question with motivation, inspiration, or new goals. But the truth is more complicated. Before a stronger identity can form, the previous one has to lose its authority, and that process has already started inside you, which means the real tension you are feeling right now is not confusion. It is structural collapse, quiet, invisible, but irreversible. And what most men fail to realize is that once this process begins, there is no comfortable way back to who you used to be. When an identity begins to fracture, the mind does not immediately accept it. The ego is designed to protect continuity. It wants the story of who you are to remain stable, predictable, recognizable. Stability creates psychological safety. It allows you to move through life without constantly questioning your own structure. But when the internal model of yourself begins to fail, the mind activates a series of quiet defense mechanisms designed to preserve the illusion that nothing fundamental has changed. One of the first responses is emotional fatigue, not the simple tiredness that comes from long workdays or poor sleep. This is deeper. It is the exhaustion that appears when your behavior continues following patterns that no longer align with your internal evolution. You wake up, you move through the same routines, you complete the same responsibilities, yet something in the background of your mind keeps asking a question that refuses to disappear. Why does this feel empty now? That question is dangerous to the ego, because if the answer is explored honestly, it often leads to the realization that a large part of your life was built on adaptation rather than intention. Adaptation is not weakness, it is survival intelligence. You adapted to expectations placed on you. You adapted to environments that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. You adapted to the roles available to you at the time. Over years, those adaptations became personality. The world began recognizing you through those patterns. People formed expectations around them, and slowly the distinction between who you are and who you adapted into began to blur. But the mind can only maintain that blur for so long. Eventually, there comes a period where internal awareness sharpens. You begin noticing how often you perform versions of yourself that feel slightly artificial. You begin noticing how certain environments drain you faster than they used to. Conversations that once felt normal now feel shallow. Achievements that once produced pride now produce only brief relief. This is not ingratitude, it is not depression, it is the early stage of identity fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs when the internal self and the performed self begin separating. The external version of you continues operating according to previous programming. It attends the meetings, maintains the relationships, pursues the goals already in motion. But internally, another process is unfolding. A quiet observer has emerged inside your mind, and that observer is no longer convinced that the current structure represents your full capacity. This internal split creates psychological tension. Part of you continues maintaining stability. Another part begins questioning everything that created that stability. The result is a strange emotional state many men struggle to explain. From the outside, life appears functional, but internally there is a growing sense of misalignment. The ego interprets this misalignment as loss of motivation, but that interpretation is incomplete. What you are actually experiencing is strategic withdrawal. Strategic withdrawal is not conscious at first. It manifests subtly. Your enthusiasm for certain activities declines. Your tolerance for meaningless interactions shortens. Your patience with environments that waste your time decreases. You begin pulling energy away from structures that no longer support your development. And because this process happens gradually, it often feels confusing. You might question your discipline, you might wonder if something is wrong with your mindset. But what is actually happening is far more precise. Your internal system is reallocating attention. It is withdrawing investment from identities that no longer provide growth. This phase can be uncomfortable because it creates temporary invisibility. The roles that once defined you start losing emotional weight, yet the new structure has not fully formed. You are standing between identities, too aware to return to the old version, but not yet stabilized in the next one. Many men panic here. They attempt to restore their previous drive through force. They overload themselves with productivity systems, motivational content, external pressure. But force does not rebuild identity. Force only temporarily suppresses awareness. If this level of thinking feels rare where you are, subscribe. Because most environments never discuss identity at this level of precision. They focus on tactics, productivity, surface improvement, but tactics applied to a fractured identity rarely produce lasting results. What matters now is understanding the deeper process unfolding beneath your behavior. The quiet withdrawal you are experiencing is not laziness, it is filtration. Your mind is beginning to reject structures that no longer match your evolving internal standard. The emotional numbness you feel toward certain goals is not failure of ambition. It is recognition that some of those ambitions were inherited rather than chosen. And once that recognition appears, your psychology begins slowly detaching from them. This is where many men encounter their first real confrontation with irrelevance. Not social irrelevance, internal irrelevance. The realization that the version of you that built your current life may not be capable of building the next one. That realization is unsettling because it exposes wasted potential. Years spent optimizing systems that were never designed for the man you are becoming. But here is the partial truth most people miss. The mind does not initiate identity fragmentation randomly. It only begins dismantling a structure when it detects the possibility of a stronger one. Your current discomfort is not proof of failure. It is evidence that the architecture of your mind has already begun scanning for something larger. And once that scan begins, the previous identity slowly loses its authority. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly. Until the version of you that once felt permanent begins to feel like a temporary phase you simply outgrew. At this stage, many men misinterpret what is happening to them. They believe they have lost something essential. Their drive feels inconsistent. Their social energy fluctuates. Their tolerance for noise, distraction, shallow interaction drops sharply. They spend more time alone. They withdraw from conversations that once felt normal. Invitations feel heavier. Familiar environments start to feel strangely small. From the outside, it can look like decline. Friends may assume you are stressed. Family may assume you are isolating. Some might even think you are becoming cold or distant. But those interpretations come from people who are still operating inside stable identities. They cannot see the process that occurs when an internal structure begins dissolving. Because when a man outgrows his identity, he does not immediately become the next version of himself. First, he becomes undefined, and undefined states are uncomfortable for the ego. The ego prefers clarity, a clear role, a clear position, a clear narrative it can defend in social environments. But during this transition, the narrative disappears. The old role loses emotional authority, yet the new role has not solidified. So you exist in an unfamiliar psychological space, not who you were, not yet who you are becoming. This is where silence begins entering your life. You speak less because you are observing more. You react less because your mind is studying patterns it previously ignored. Your attention becomes selective. You start noticing how predictable most social behavior is. How often people repeat the same emotional reactions, the same complaints, the same ambitions, without examining whether those ambitions actually belong to them. The more you see it, the harder it becomes to fully participate in it. This is why many men entering this phase begin experiencing deeper solitude, not because they were rejected, but because their perception changed. The conversations that once stimulated them now feel rehearsed. The goals that once created urgency now feel strangely inherited. And the environments that once provided belonging now feel like structures designed for a previous version of themselves, so they withdraw, quietly, strategically. Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of recalibration. What most people fail to understand is that solitude during identity transition is not social failure, it is psychological reconstruction. The mind requires distance from old environments in order to examine the beliefs those environments reinforced. Without distance, the old patterns remain invisible. They continue running automatically because the surroundings constantly reactivate them. But when distance appears, awareness sharpens. You begin asking questions that would have felt dangerous before. Why did I pursue this path? Which ambitions were actually mine? Which parts of my personality were simply adaptations for approval, survival, acceptance? These questions destabilize the ego because they expose how much of your life was built unconsciously. But they are also necessary. Because identity reconstruction cannot begin until the previous model is fully examined, and this is where the real pressure appears. Because dismantling an identity is one thing, rebuilding one incorrectly is another. If a man rushes this phase, he often replaces one borrowed identity with another. He adopts a new ideology, a new persona, a new external framework, and mistakes it for transformation. On the surface, it looks like progress, but internally the same dependency remains. His sense of self is still anchored to external definitions. True reconstruction is slower. It requires restraint. It requires tolerating a period where you do not immediately fill the empty space left by your previous identity. And that period can feel unsettling. You may feel temporarily invisible, not because you lost value, but because you are no longer projecting a predictable version of yourself. People respond to stability. When your identity is shifting, their expectations lose footing. They cannot categorize you as easily. Some will drift away, some will misunderstand your silence, some will assume you are lost. Let them assume. Because the reconstruction phase was never designed for public approval. It was designed for internal clarity. And clarity grows in quiet environments. That is why many men going through this transition start reorganizing their attention without announcing it. They consume information differently. They become more deliberate with time. Their tolerance for distraction shrinks. Their standards begin rising quietly, even if they cannot yet fully articulate them. The outside world may interpret this as distance, but internally something precise is happening. Your mind is reevaluating every structure that previously defined you. Your ambitions, your discipline, your relationships, your tolerance for mediocrity. Nothing passes through that internal filter unchanged. And once this level of examination begins, the pressure builds slowly, because the longer you observe your previous life structure with this level of awareness, the harder it becomes to return to it. Comment the city you're watching from, not for engagement, but for observation, because more men are moving through this silent reconstruction than most people realize. And the strange part is this. Most of them believe they are alone in it, but they are not. They are simply in the same phase of identity collapse, quiet, invisible, and not yet finished. There is a moment during identity collapse where the mind searches for someone to blame. It is almost automatic. The ego looks for external explanations that can preserve the old self-image. It scans your past, your upbringing, your opportunities, the people who disappointed you, the systems that limited you, the circumstances that slowed you down. And many of those factors were real. Some environments were restrictive, some people underestimated you, some opportunities never appeared when they should have, but none of those explanations can rebuild a man. They can explain pain, they cannot produce power. At a certain point in psychological reconstruction, something uncomfortable must happen. The mind must stop negotiating with the past. Not because the past was fair, but because fairness is irrelevant to forward movement. The moment you begin rebuilding identity, the question changes. It is no longer, what caused this? It becomes, what structure replaces it? This is where victimhood quietly tries to survive. Not always in obvious ways. Most men do not walk around consciously declaring themselves victims. The pattern is subtler. It appears in the form of hesitation, delayed action, the quiet belief that progress requires better conditions, better timing, better external alignment. But the reconstruction phase does not reward waiting. It rewards control. Control over attention first. Because attention is the foundation of identity. Whatever consistently occupies your focus slowly programs your internal standard. If your attention remains scattered between distractions, resentment, and digital noise, your mind cannot stabilize the new structure forming inside you. The brain begins adapting to whatever environment it consumes most frequently. Feed it chaos long enough, and chaos becomes normal. Feed it discipline long enough, and discipline becomes the baseline. This is not motivational language, it is simple neurological adaptation. The second layer is behavioral consistency, not dramatic transformation, not temporary intensity, consistency, the quiet repetition of actions that reinforce the identity you are building. Many men sabotage this phase by trying to become a completely different person overnight. They overload themselves with new routines, new goals, new expectations. Then when they inevitably fail to maintain that intensity, the ego interprets it as confirmation that nothing has changed. But reconstruction does not respond to emotional bursts. It responds to repetition. Small actions performed daily begin sending signals to the brain about who you are becoming. Wake up earlier consistently and the mind adjusts its rhythm. Train your body regularly and the nervous system adapts to higher stress tolerance. Limit meaningless stimulation and your focus sharpens over time. Each action appears small in isolation, but together they create psychological authority, and authority is what replaces the instability created during identity collapse. The third layer is emotional containment. This is where many men struggle because modern culture encourages emotional discharge rather than emotional management. Every frustration must be expressed. Every doubt must be shared. Every internal conflict must be externalized. But uncontrolled expression weakens structure. Emotion is information, nothing more. It tells you where tension exists inside your system. But it does not deserve command authority over your behavior. If every emotional fluctuation changes your direction, you will rebuild your identity on unstable ground. Containment does not mean suppression, it means observation without surrender. You notice the frustration, you notice the doubt, you notice the impulse to escape discipline, but you do not grant those signals command power over your actions. Your behavior remains anchored to the structure you are building, not the emotion you are temporarily experiencing. This is where real responsibility begins appearing. Not the social version of responsibility where you simply fulfill obligations to others. Real responsibility means you accept authorship over the man you are becoming. No one else constructs that architecture, not your environment, not your past, not the approval of others. You do. Which means the collapse you experienced earlier was not punishment, it was exposure. Exposure of habits that weakened you, exposure of environments that diluted your standards, exposure of behaviors you tolerated simply because they were comfortable. Once exposed, those patterns cannot remain, because now you see them clearly, and clarity removes excuses. That is the moment reconstruction becomes serious, because once a man sees exactly where his weakness lives, he has two options. He can continue negotiating with it, or he can remove it. There is no neutral position anymore. The quiet phase of observation ends here. Now structure must replace awareness, and structure requires discipline, not dramatic discipline for a few weeks, controlled discipline for years. If this confrontation is useful to you, subscribe, not for motivation, but for precision, because most people discuss improvement emotionally. Very few discuss it structurally, and structure is the only thing strong enough to stabilize a rebuilt identity. Without it, collapse turns into decay. With it collapse becomes evolution, and you are much closer to that line than you realize. Earlier, something uncomfortable was stated. The version of you that built your current life is no longer sufficient. At the time, that statement may have felt threatening. The ego naturally resists anything that suggests its authority is fading. For years it protected you, organized your behavior, maintained your stability. But stability is not the highest function of a man. Stability simply prevents collapse. It does not guarantee growth. What you have been experiencing throughout this process is not random discomfort. It is the slow recognition that the structure that once carried you forward has reached its limit. The mind sensed it first, that quiet dissatisfaction, the strange fatigue toward goals that once felt important, the withdrawal from conversations that suddenly felt empty. Then the deeper awareness followed, the realization that many parts of your identity were built through adaptation rather than deliberate design. This is where reconstruction begins, not by adding motivation, not by chasing external breakthroughs, but by removing what weakens your structure. The first thing that must disappear is borrowed ambition. Many men spend years pursuing goals that were never fully theirs. They inherited them from culture, family expectations, or social comparison. Success was defined for them before they ever questioned whether those definitions aligned with their internal standards. Reconstruction demands that those borrowed objectives lose authority. What replaces them must be chosen deliberately, not because it impresses people, but because it strengthens you. The second thing that must be eliminated is unnecessary noise. Attention is the rarest resource you possess. Whatever occupies it repeatedly becomes the architecture of your thinking. If your attention remains scattered across endless stimulation, shallow information, and constant digital distraction, the mind never stabilizes. A clear identity requires quiet space to form. The men who rebuild themselves successfully become extremely selective with what enters their mental environment. Then something must be built, not fantasies. Structure. Structure in how you spend your time. Structure in how you manage your physical state. Structure in the standards you enforce inside your own behavior. Discipline is often misunderstood as restriction. In reality, it is stabilization. It removes randomness from your life. And once randomness disappears, direction becomes possible. The man you are becoming is not louder, he is clearer. He does not chase validation because his identity is not constructed from other people's reactions. He does not panic during uncertainty because he understands that identity growth requires periods of instability. He does not negotiate with weak habits because he has already seen where those habits lead. But reconstruction also requires endurance. Not everything improves immediately. Some environments will feel uncomfortable as your standards rise. Some relationships will lose compatibility as your direction becomes sharper. At times, you will feel alone in your thinking because most people around you are still operating inside inherited identities. That is normal. Transformation often looks like isolation before it looks like success. But here's the part many people misunderstand. Strength does not come from rejecting the world. It comes from engaging it without losing yourself. When your identity is stable, you move through environments without absorbing their weakness. You interact with people without adopting their limitations. You can operate inside chaos without becoming chaotic. That is the real breakthrough. Not luck, not sudden opportunity, internal authority. And once a man builds that authority, something interesting happens. Life begins responding differently to him, not through miracles or mysterious forces, but through alignment. His decisions become sharper, his boundaries become clearer, his actions become consistent enough that results finally compound. Opportunities appear because his behavior signals readiness. Respect appears because his presence communicates structure. Progress appears because he no longer sabotages his own direction. This closes the loop we opened at the beginning. Something inside you did end. But it was never your potential. It was the outdated identity that could no longer carry you forward. What replaces it is not a completely different person, it is a more deliberate one, quieter, more controlled, more dangerous in the best possible sense. Because a man who understands his own structure cannot be easily manipulated by the expectations of others. And if you feel that shift happening inside you right now, that is not imagination, it is a recognition. The early stages of a stronger identity stabilizing. If this level of thinking resonates with you, subscribe. Not as a casual action, but as a signal. A signal that you are intentionally building the next version of yourself rather than drifting into it. And if you want to continue sharpening this mindset, watch the next video that is appearing on your screen right now. Because identity reconstruction does not happen in a single realization. It happens through continuous refinement. And the men who understand that process are the ones who quietly rebuild their lives while everyone else is still trying to understand what changed.